Today we have the privilege of interviewing Dawn Bremmer from Brunswick, New Brunswick. She became a teacher, historian, keeper, and education was a big part of that, and an activist, serving 5 years at the Advisory Council. Okay, so what is your full name?
Myra Dawn McGowan Bremner.
Did you have a nickname when you were growing up?
Not really.
No?
That my husband called me various things, but I didn't really have a nickname that I answered to very much.
Okay, when were you born?
I was born on October 25th, 1939.
Where were you born?
I was born in the house where I live now.
Really?
It's the room that I use for the dining room.
Wow.
And my mom was born there as well. And my grandmother, I don't think she was born there. I think she was born somewhere else, but she lived in that house, and so did my great-grandmother. And it was her grandfather that built it. So I live in a house that has been in our family for a very long time.
That's amazing. Okay, what are your parents' full names?
My dad was James Guy McGowan, and my mother was Edrie Chandler Caldwell.
Did you have any siblings?
Yes, I had a brother and a sister.
What were their names?
My brother was Glenn, and my sister was Heather.
Tell me about your family.
We were a pretty ordinary family. That my brother and my sister were both younger than me. I was telling someone recently that the day my brother was born, and he was born in the same place I was, my grandfather, who was a lovely man, took me to the workshop with him, and I played in the sawdust in the workshop. And when we came in at noon, I had a new brother.
Oh,
Very exciting.
yes.
And my Heather is younger than that. She's 9 years younger than me, and we are very close. She and I are very good friends.
That's good. Have you always lived in this community?
No, in a way I've been here just about my whole life, but lived away for, I suppose it'd be 13 years altogether.
Oh, wow. Can you describe what it was like living at home with like rooms, electricity, telephones?
When I first remember, I lived in my great-grandmother's house. This was, my mom and dad were married, and this was the Depression, and it was hard to find a place to live, etc. And my great-grandmother needed care by that point, so they lived with her, and my dad's mom lived there as well. So I was a fairly spoiled little kid. That there was my mom and my dad and my grandmother, who was a very affectionate woman, a very capable woman. She had been left a widow when my dad was 6, and she was just a very strong, very capable woman. And I spent a lot of time with her, and I credit her with encouraging me to do things and telling me, if you try, you'll be able to do this, you'll be able to do that. And she let me help her. We would chase the sheep and pick apples and all kinds of things. So she was a very good influence. And of course, the great-grandmother thought that I couldn't do anything wrong. So, whatever you wanted to do in her part of the house, you were allowed. And I don't know that that's good for a little kid, but but it was okay.
Wow. Did you have any traditions, like what do you do for Christmas or Easter?
I'd like to tell you more about the family, because we only lived there, that none of my siblings ever lived in that situation with us. That my dad was in the Army, and they bought a house, and so we moved into our own home. And that house, like many of them in the community, didn't have electricity. In the whole community, there were a few houses, probably count them on one hand, that were wired, that had electricity before the war started. But then during the war, none of that kind of stuff got done, that everything went into the war effort. So it was after the war that they started to put electricity into the houses. And I remember, well, particularly during the war, my mom, my brother, and I stayed with my Caldwell grandparents in the house where I live now quite a little bit. And I remember my grandfather, whom I told you was a very lovely man, used to do, in the wintertime, he'd do a jigsaw puzzle in the dining room, in the kitchen. No, it's not in the kitchen, in the living room, on one of these old square tables. And the light would be an Aladdin lamp, which is sort of a step up from an oil lamp. It gave a better light, and if you really had to study your lessons, they would light the Aladdin lamps, and you could study by that light. But he would do puzzles, and he would take me on his lap, and I would help him do puzzles, and that sort of has stayed with me. And even this past winter, I did a couple of puzzles in the living room on the same table, and grandfather was very close.
Yeah, sounds like it. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, you go on.
Do you have any traditions?
I'm sure that that we observed a lot of different traditions. I can't remember specifically. Mind you, as kids, we went to Sunday school and whatever, and church. And after church on Sundays, quite often, my grandfather would take me home with him to have Sunday dinner with them. And it was he and grandmother and other people. Lots of times it was my grandmother's brother and his wife, Uncle Harry and Aunt Cora. Sometimes it was my grandfather's brother, Uncle Mont. And they would talk over the meal. Then they would sit in what was called the parlor then, not the living room. And they would talk about family history and about this and that and the other thing. And I sort of sat and took in a good deal of it. And I think that's one of the reasons when I got older that I got very, very involved in local history and local heritage and local traditions. And that's been a motivating factor for me for a fairly good portion of my adult life. But this going to grandfather's for Sunday dinner. And Sunday dinner was probably a tradition in many, many homes. That was, that was the day that family got together. And pretty often there would be a roast, or maybe chicken. But when you were the housewife, this roast sort of reappeared on through the week. You'd have it again on Monday, and on Tuesday the bones would have been made into a stew, and so that was certainly a tradition at that point. Christmases were probably a little different than now. The Christmas tree almost always was cut Christmas Eve day. That often thought later that it was a very good idea that Mom get Dad and the kids out of the house for an hour or two while they went to get a Christmas tree so that she could, finish up all the things she needed to do. Then it was brought in, and it wasn't generally trimmed till after the kids went to bed. And when you got old enough to be able to stay up and help trim the tree, by the time you were 11 or 12, it was sort of a promotion. You were starting to be grown up when you could stay up and help trim the tree Christmas Eve.
Oh, sounds very nice.
And then in the morning, you would come down, and in some other families, there are different traditions, but we always had to wait until after the animals were fed to open. You had breakfast and you'd had your stocking first. That sort of took the edge off, so you could go through your stocking first. But then you had to wait till after have some breakfast, and after the animals were fed, then you all sat around together and opened packages.
Did you have any chores around the house?
Yes, I can remember some of them. Some of them were outside too. I wasn't very big, maybe 7 or so, when it was my job, in the summertime at least, to go and get the cattle and bring them bring them in from the pasture to be milked in the evening. Didn't have to in the morning. I don't know, maybe in the morning they were all, I don't remember what it was like in the morning, but in the evening that was one of the things you needed to do. I remember my grandmother used to let me gather the eggs, and this was okay, but sometimes the hen would still be on the nest, and I wouldn't want to bother her. And my grandmother would say, "Well, you just put your hand in underneath her and get the egg." I wasn't very fond of that because hens would peck at you when you went to disturb them. So that wasn't a chore that I. It was great as long as the hens were sitting on their nests still. In the house, I can remember my mom. And this was another tradition. On Saturdays for supper, you had baked beans. And probably brown bread and whatever. But that was one of the jobs that I had. My mom would give me the beans to pick over, because they would have been field beans, and there would still be a bit of chaff in them maybe, or stone, or this or that, and so you had to pick over the beans, and I can remember doing that. And, various other things.
Where did you go to school?
I went to school at the Oneroom School in Jemseg. I have a picture of it over there, actually. It was built about 1885, only after a lot of conversation and pressure put on the local people by the superintendent. There were other schools in the community, but they were older and they were spread out, and some of them were overcrowded, so there had to be a new school. And they didn't get around to building it until he told them that the county grant for schools would not be paid unless they started a new school. So it was built about 1885, and my grandmother and grandfather both attended that school. They had both, no, they hadn't both been in other schools before, but some of those other schools still stayed in operation for a bit longer, but eventually both of them were attending that school. My mom and her brother and sister went to that school. I went to that school with my mom, not with my mom, with my brother and my sister, and my own kids actually got to go to that school for 2 or 3 years when they were, in elementary.
How were you in school? Grades, behavior?
How do you mean?
Like, did you have always good grades?
Pretty much, but starting school was a big problem. For some reason, I had trouble pronouncing certain letters, S's and R's, for instance. And in the first grade reader, the very first one you got, I don't know if the kids get readers anymore, but in those days it was a big deal that you started in a primer, which was the very first book, and then you went to a first grade reader, and you had a standard literature book reader through until to the end of grade 12. That, whether you were in whichever one, you knew what book you were going to have, kind of thing. But in that first primer, a lot of the stories were about squirrels. And if you couldn't say S or R properly, it was something. I don't remember exactly. But, and we didn't have a really sensitive teacher at that point. And she made fun of the way I would say words. So that didn't help. And also, I wasn't very well coordinated. And what you did in the afternoon in these graded schools, she had kids up through grade 8 or 9, in your scribbler, she would put a sentence, today is Wednesday, or, that kind of thing. And then you were expected to fill the whole page, copy this over with the idea that your writing would get better. Mine didn't actually get any better. So that was another problem. But I learned to read, and that was the very best thing that happened at school. That I learned to read, and then once I was able to read, everything sort of fell into place. That, you maybe couldn't read my writing, but But I had lots of things to talk to say.
How many kids were in your class?
In grade 1, there were 3 of us.
Oh, wow, really?
And by grade 3, there were 2 of us. And then there were 2 of us in grade 6, and Lorna's family moved away, and I was by myself in grade 7.
Wow.
And at that point, the teacher taught grade 7 and 8 the same thing. So, so at the end of grade 7, I simply wrote high school entrance and went to grade 9. It was, the kind of accommodation that they did with those small schools, that there weren't a whole lot of rules and regulations that says you can't be in such and such a grade until you have had your, and even at the beginning, that you can't be in grade 1 until you have had your 5th birthday. It didn't always apply. But, there was accommodation.
Did you have to walk to and from school?
Yeah. And it was, a little more than half a mile, probably. Wasn't too bad. If I stayed with my grandmother, it was good. It was a long walk. That was about, another quarter of a mile at least. It was at least a mile to school when I stayed with them, but that wasn't that often during school time. And in those days, for the first 3 grades, you went to school from 9 until quarter of 11. Then there was recess, and from grade 4 on, the kids went back from 11 till 12. But everybody in up to grade 3 got out. So all through elementary school, except in the wintertime in very bad weather, we went home for lunch.
Oh,
So that was kind of neat. And it was the same in the afternoon. You went to school from 1 until quarter of 3. And if you were in one of the small grades, you went home then. But older kids stayed. They went back and they had recess from quarter of 3 till 3. And at 3, you went in, and from 3 to 4. And then you went home.
wow. What were some things you did after school?
Oh. Did all kinds of things depending upon the weather. I think it was typical of kids in our day, played outdoors a lot. That there's always something to do. In the spring, your father would have tapped trees, and what you did after school was go and pick up the sap. Or when the water was high, we used to go and walk along the shore where the driftwood had come in, and there was always a dog to go with us, and we'd throw sticks for the dog, and and there were other kids live nearby. We used to play together quite a bit, not so much on a school day. That was more a weekend thing to play, and of course in the winter where we lived, there was water, ponds in the marsh to skate, and there was a bit of a hill where we could slide. A little further away from this, 2 farms over, there was a very, very good sliding hill, and that was a lot of fun. And in the summer, again, this wasn't after school particularly, but in the summer, we swam a lot. And we had a canoe as well. And used to start with, we were only allowed to be on a small pond where the water was maybe 2 feet deep. And then as we got older, we were allowed to take it into the marsh, which wasn't really, really deep, but it was a good expanse of water in the springtime, and that was fun. And then I suppose by the time we were able to swim well, then we were allowed to take the canoe more or less wherever.
Mm-hmm. Did you finish high school?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Did you go on to post-secondary school?
Yes, I did, yeah.
What were you studying when you went?
I went to UNB, and I did a Bachelor of Arts and education along with it, and got a teacher's certificate as well.
Is that what you wanted to be, a teacher when you were older?
At that point, that's what I wanted to do. That's what I was doing, what I was trained to do.
Okay.
And
yes.
I was going to go on. I was going to say I taught all told for about 6 years, and I sort of got sidetracked into other things.
Okay. Did you spend time with your friends a lot?
Not particularly. Again, in those days, transportation was, if it was a long ways away, you know, you didn't have friends. I did have a friend next door, but, you know, we played together some. But as far as socializing, most everyone that you were at school with, particularly ones who had to go to high school, were too far away.
Oh, okay.
That it was just, you know, you knew them and you were with them at school, but there wasn't the capacity to, and at that point, most families, well, some families would have no vehicle at all, but others, you know, they would still have their horse and carriage, but others, you know, most families only had one vehicle.
Okay.
And if the father was working somewhere, you know, there wasn't any way to get to visit anybody. Not much, you know, we associated, but it wasn't at a regular basis. It wasn't, you didn't see them every day unless it was at school. It was the only place you really saw a lot of your friends.
Okay. What are some funny stories you can tell me, or is that stories that just kind of stick out to you?
Oh my goodness. I would have to think about that.
Stories?
Enjoyed being outdoors. I enjoyed horses when I was young. I enjoyed reading, and I'm still very involved in books. And actually, on behalf of the Queens County Heritage, I've run a secondhand book business for quite a few years, and that's been fascinating.
What were some funny stories you can tell me?
I'm trying to remember incidents. One thing that I remember that was interesting to say the least, that I said there were playmates next door. One of them was Lita, who actually just died a week ago. But we'd play at her place. And to get from her place to ours, and vice versa, you had to go down a hill and around a curve through a hollow and then up the other hill. Now, there weren't woods right beside the road, but it was pretty isolated. And in those days, there was electricity, but, you know, there was the porch light at Dykeman's and the porch light at our place. And it was always a question about walking home in the dark. And so, you know, Lita would come part way down the hill, down toward the hollow with me, and then she'd go back and I'd go through and then up to, and one time I was coming and there was this awful noise back in the woods. It was a sort of a scream. It sounded like it was whoo kind of noise, and it kept going. And of course, when you're a kid, you've heard all kinds of stories about panthers and ghost stories too, but I don't think we put much stock in those, but didn't know what it was. Terrified and ran home and didn't know what it was then, but found out the next day or two that a guy I know was out hunting at night, which you're not supposed to be doing, but he was. And he had startled a deer, and this was a big buck deer in the fall, and this deer was snorting at him. And it was the deer snorting, but what a weird sound. And it was terrifying at the time.
How old when you got your first job?
When I was in the summer I was finished grade 9. I actually worked for someone on a farm. This was a woman that had 3 little kids and a whole lot of farm workers there, and she needed a babysitter come person to help with serving the meals and washing the dishes and amusing the youngsters and keeping them safe and whatnot. So I worked for them for the summer, and it was fun. It was Some of it wasn't fun, because after you've fed 15 people, there's an awful lot of dishes. But it was certainly worth doing.
Yes.
And of course, like many country kids, I picked strawberries, I picked up potatoes, I picked beans. I don't like picking beans. But the other strawberries and potatoes are kind of fun.
Did you get married?
Yes.
How old were you when you got married?
I was 21.
21.
It was.
So yes, no?
I was going to say it was someone I met at university, and it was very interesting, actually. But in those days, the first week you were at university, they did orientation, and people in second year or whatever would take little groups of people and do a tour of the campus and this and that and the other thing. And this guy was the one that took us on this tour. And we started going out and we're married.
What was your spouse's full name?
He goes by Ted. He's someone with a nickname, and most people know him as Ted, but he's Theodore William Bremner.
Did you have a family?
Yes, but they're not with us anymore. We had two boys, and they are both gone.
What are you doing now?
I was going to say nothing. But no, I'm still involved in a lot of things. I still have standard bred horses. I don't have them at home. Got to the point that I was breeding horses, and it meant a lot of care of mares and babies, and getting up in the night to deliver foals, and the work and the stress got to be more than I could handle. So about 8 years ago, maybe, I found homes for my brood mares, and so I don't have more mares and babies at home, but I do have 2 standard bred horses at the racetrack, and still very involved with them, and I'm still on the board of Harness Racing New Brunswick. I'm still involved in some heritage things, not nearly as much as I was.
Okay.
For a long time, I was editing a newsletter for Queens County Heritage. I was very involved. I was on their board for, I don't know, for 30 years probably, at least. And I also served on the board of the New Brunswick Museum, and later on the board of the King's Landing Corporation. But I have retired from those things at this point, and I'm not nearly so involved in that. But I'm still writing stuff. I write an article for the Lions Flyer every month, and I'm working on the history of Jemseg. It's an ongoing project. I've got quite a lot of stuff done, but it's not ready to publish yet. That we're sort of hoping. I'm working with another woman now because she's a great photographer. We're sort of thinking by fall we might have it done. So working on that, and I'm finally free enough to go to be involved with the New Brunswick Genealogical Society, which is genealogy was one of my first passions as far as history goes. This dates back to sitting with my grandparents and their siblings and listening to all these stories about relatives long gone. And so I'm enjoying doing that.
You said earlier you were a historian and keeper. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Well, we've just been talking about some of this because, I'm still writing stuff, and I'm still very interested in the collecting and preservation of heritage artifacts, and particularly interested in the interpretation. That I am fascinated with the exhibits that they're doing each summer at the museums and things like that. And again, education is a part of that because somebody said, "What do you people do?" And honestly, what we are storytellers. That we take an artifact. Now, can you tell me what this is? And, it's an ox shoe. what's an ox? And, I really enjoy doing this with kids, with little kids, and that's always fun. But, the interpretation and linking people with their own heritage is something that I think is really important. That I think knowing where you've come from, knowing who your ancestors were, spending time with your grandparents, if you're lucky enough to have grandparents, gives you a sense of who you are and gives you strength, something to fall back on. It's when you realize that you come from a long line of strong, capable people that, they might have been lumbermen or fishermen or farmers or a teacher or a college professor or whatever, but you've got a long line of people behind you. And I think you draw strength from that. So that's one of the goals, is to get people involved with their heritage, get people thinking about who they are in relation to where they are now, but also in relation to the long line of people that were here before us.
Yes. You were an activist. Would you like to?
Yes, I got involved. I have too many enthusiasms. I get involved in a wide variety of things, and whether that's being a Renaissance person or whether it's simply being a butterfly, I'm not sure. But I served on the Advisory Council on the Status of Women, two different appointments, and that was eye-opening, to say the least. And one of the things that I was particularly involved in there, I was involved in a lot of different things, but when I say a lot of different things, one of them was on a committee to establish the mammogram program, the breast health program that the province runs now and has done for about 25 years. But we were involved in getting that in place, and how it should be operated, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of that was. A lot of my work with that was education-oriented. We spent a lot of time talking to young women, spent a lot of time talking to older women too, who tended to rather have a single focus, and the fact that many of them ended up without husbands, through that women live longer than men, and women who simply didn't understand anything about finance, anything about, many of them not even knowing how to drive, that this was a sad situation. So we worked on that, but I was very involved with young women saying, you have to learn how to do something. You have to have a sellable skill. That one quote that I thought was interesting was from Laura Sabian. She said to one young woman, now what are you going to do when you grow up? And she said, I'm going to get married. And Laura said, that takes about half an hour. What else are you going to do? And this is important. You have to have something else to do. You have to be able to look after yourself. And in current times, that's even more important. That there's, marriage and family and home life is important and lovely, and it's a great ambition, but you also have to keep your wits about you and say, this may not last. I may be left alone with two little kids. I have to be able to, work as a hairdresser, work at this, work at that. I have to have a skill. I have to be able to, I have to understand computers. I have to be able to manage, manage an office. I have to know how to do something if I'm the one that has to put bread on the table. And so that's, I did a lot of that. But the activism went on, and that's not the only reason, of course, that I got involved with horses. But you can only talk about things for so long, and you have to go ahead and do something. Sort of I guess the saying is put your money where your mouth is. So early on in the early 1980s, I ran for public office to be MLA for this area. Slightly different riding at that point, different boundaries, but I didn't get elected. But at the same time, that was still, I think, served as an example for other women, because you look now, and there are a number of women in the legislature, and when you look at the federal cabinet with the 15 women and 15 men, you think, yay, somebody somewhere heard us. So, I got involved in that. I say got involved with my horses, but I served on various groups and committees with that. I was the first woman president of the Atlantic Standardbred Breeders Association, which was, operated stakes programs. I was on the first Maritime Provinces Harness Racing Commission, and I was the only woman ever to serve on that until about 3 months ago.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and now Glenna Greer is on that group, so that I'm delighted. But, you make progress slowly, but you have to get out there and do stuff too. And I've also been involved with, and this is part of being an activist, I'm sure, been involved with the Queens County Fair Association and with the Jemseg Farmers Market, that I was co-chair of a committee that got that started. That there was someone from the Lions and someone from the Women's Institute, and we said, wouldn't it be great if we had a market? And it's been pretty successful for a number of years. Right now, it's a bit of a doldrums, but I think it'll recover. Like many places, I think it'll recover.
How did your life now compare to your life when you were younger?
Oh dear. Like with many, many people, it's very different. Mm-hmm. That communication is totally different. That I can't get my email to work today, but it does most times. It will work. And it wasn't that long ago that your means of communication was a telephone. And it would have been, when I first remember, it was a box on the wall and a crank on the side of it. And when you wanted to talk to someone, you picked up the receiver and made sure nobody else was talking, because you were on a party line with about 12 other people or more, so nobody's talking. You'd ring this, and if it was someone on your own line, you had to know what their number was, and whether it was 2 long rings, or it was a long and a short and a long, or whether it was 3 short rings, And when you heard that, you heard 3. Our number was 13, so it was a long and 3 little rings. And so when you heard, you knew somebody was on the phone, so you'd pick it up. And lots of times a whole lot of other people picked it up too, so it wasn't very private. But as a kid, that was what the telephone was like. And do any of you guys remember dial telephones?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, but I think you'd go quite a ways to find one now. Mm-hmm. And so that has changed. Certainly communication has changed a lot. That I was telling you, I'm involved with the book place, with the secondhand book business. But that is changing enormously as well. That a lot of people, especially people in the younger generation, get their, they watch television, they watch movies, they have all sorts of communications devices that aren't printed word. And that's a big difference. Also, when we were kids, there was no electricity, there was no television. That probably when I was in my teens, we had television. And the first televisions I remember were black and white and very snowy half the time. And you could get 2 channels. Somebody said you could get 3. You could get CBC, you could get another one, and you could get fog. But those things have changed enormously, and also newspapers were really important then. That if not everybody would get the newspaper, but many people would, and people, that's how they got their news. And even radios. When I was a youngster, there were radios and whatever. But before that, just not even a whole generation before that, only a few people had radios. And if there was something coming on, something important, like the Queen would be the king at that point, was speaking, you'd go to somebody's house, a bunch of people together to listen to the king, or listen to Joe Louis, to a fight, a boxing match or whatever. And you asked me what I did for entertainment and whatnot when I was young. When I was in high school, probably grade 9, 10, as I said, there wasn't much transportation, so we were home. On Saturday evenings, in the winter, I'd do a jigsaw puzzle and listen to Foster Hewitt broadcasting the hockey game. And, this was entertainment enough.
Yes. Is there anything else you'd like to tell me?
Oh, I don't know. There are probably loads and loads.
What was the first horse that you remember having?
Oh, the very first horse I remember belonged to my dad. She was called Bay Kate. And I do have a picture of Kate. And that's my dad and me. So you can see I'm sitting on top of this horse. The other horses from very early on were my grandfather's horses. I told you about my grandfather and how kind he was. But he had a team of black horses, and he called them Puss and Queen, and there they are.
Wow. What kind of horse were they?
They were draft horses, but they weren't any particular breed. That there'd be some Percheron in them, but normally Percherons are big, big, big. These guys weren't all that big. They were plenty big enough to plow and haul logs and things like that, but they weren't that big. They were just sort of horses.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to tell me?
Well, I can tell you about, someone asked me about the last horse, or one of the horses I have now. This was maybe the best horse I ever had. Her name was Rose Valley, and as a 3-year-old, she won a lot of races. That she was what we'd call a stakes horse, and so she raced in Truro and Summerside and Charlottetown and Fredericton and St. John, and she won a number of races, and we enjoyed her a lot.
Wow. She's beautiful.
Yeah, we loved her. Unfortunately, she came to a bad end, that she was in a race in Summerside. It was the final of forget what it was called. It was the best mares, the aged mares final. And she broke a leg, and she had to be put down. So that was very sad. But I went to a horse sale within the week. That this happened on Sunday, and Friday there was a horse sale on the island. So we went to the sale, and I bought her half-sister. So I have another filly now called Cajun Fiddle, and she should race this summer.
Wow. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.